When I walked into the courtroom, my daughter smirked, and my son-in-law just shook his head with open contempt. I was wearing my simple country clothes, worn-out boots, and held an old hat in my hands. I looked like a lost farmer, a confused old man who did not understand where he was. I saw Victoria whisper something to Preston, and he smiled with that arrogance that had always defined him. I heard her choked laugh, a sound that cut through my chest like a knife. To them, I was an embarrassment, an inconvenience, a silly old fool who had no business being there. But then the judge looked up. His eyes met mine. I watched as the color drained from his face, as his hand trembled on the wooden gavel. His lips moved, and he whispered something that silenced the entire courtroom. "My God," he said, "is it really him?" Everyone turned to look at me. The silence became so thick I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. Victoria stopped smiling. Preston frowned, confused, staring at the judge as if he had lost his mind. They had no idea who I truly was. Not until that moment. My name is Harris Hans Caldwell. I am 70 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a retired man living a quiet life, I thought I had escaped the deceit of the world, but maintained a close bond with my only child. If you are connecting with my story, please hit the like button to bring a little sunshine to this father's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next life stories, and tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me really happy to know which corner of the country or the world is listening to me. It all started 3 months ago on what was supposed to be a peaceful Thursday afternoon at my secluded farm just outside of Richmond, Virginia. Since my beautiful wife Diane passed away 2 years ago, this farm had been my entire world. It was a quiet sanctuary away from the noise of the city, a place where I could tend to my garden, feed the chickens, and sit on the porch remembering the good decades Diane and I had shared. I had gladly handed over the complex financial chores to my son-in-law Preston. He was a sharp, fast-talking venture capitalist who married my daughter Victoria 10 years ago. I trusted them. They were my blood, my family. That afternoon, I walked down the long dirt driveway to check the mailbox. Among the grocery store flyers and seed catalogs, there was a thick envelope with a bright red urgent stamp on the front. It was from the county tax assessor. I tore it open, expecting it to be a routine receipt. Instead, the bold black letters at the top of the page made the breath catch in my throat. Final notice of default, property tax delinquency, imminent foreclosure warning. I stood there in the driveway, the autumn wind suddenly feeling like ice against my skin. I read the document 3 times. In it stated that my property taxes were 90 days past due, and if the balance was not settled by the end of the month, the county would begin proceedings to seize the farm. My farm, the home where Diane and I had planned to spend our final days. This made absolutely no sense. Exactly 1 month prior, I had transferred $35.00 directly into Preston's account specifically to cover these property taxes. He had assured me over a family dinner that everything was taken care of, that I should not stress my retired mind with paperwork and wire transfers. I immediately pulled out my phone and dialed Victoria's number. My hands were shaking, not from age, but from a sudden sharp spike of adrenaline. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice carrying the background noise of a busy upscale restaurant. "Hello, Dad. I'm in the middle of a lunch meeting. Can I call you back?" "Victoria, I need to know why I just received a foreclosure warning from the county tax assessor," I said, keeping my voice as level as possible. "I gave Preston the money for the taxes 4 weeks ago. What is going on?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The background noise seemed to muffle. "Dad, calm down," she said, her tone dripping with that patronizing sweetness you used to soothe a panicked child. "Preston handled that. You probably just got a delayed automated letter. Do not worry about it. We will come over tonight and sort it out. Just rest." They arrived at the farm just after sunset. The headlights of Preston's sleek black luxury sedan swept across the front porch where I was waiting. Preston stepped out first, wearing an expensive tailored suit, looking entirely unbothered. Victoria followed, clutching a designer handbag, her face set in an expression of exhausted patience. I invited them into the living room and placed the final default notice on the coffee table. "Explain this to me, Preston," I said, pointing at the bold red ink. Preston did not even pick up the paper. He simply sighed, unbuttoned his suit jacket, and sat back on my sofa with an arrogant ease. "Harrison, you are getting worked up over nothing," he said smoothly. "I paid the taxes weeks ago. The county administration is notoriously slow at updating their mailing lists. You know how these government bureaucracies operate, but this letter was printed 3 days ago," I countered, tapping the date at the top of the page. "It explicitly says, 'No payment has been received. Me if you paid it, show me the bank confirmation receipt right now.'" Preston exchanged a quick, exasperated look with Victoria. It was a look that screamed, "Here we go again with the crazy old man. Dad, stop interrogating him," Victoria snapped, stepping forward and placing a perfectly manicured hand on Preston's shoulder. "He is doing you a favor by managing your accounts. You have been forgetting everything lately. You are confused." "I am not confused, Victoria. I am reading a legal document." "You are confused, Dad," she insisted, raising her voice just enough to dominate the room. Her eyes locked onto mine, unyielding and cold. "Do you not realize how bad your memory has gotten? Last week you forgot the name of my new dog. 2 days ago, you called me asking what day it was. And yesterday," she paused, letting out a dramatic trembling breath. "Yesterday we stopped by while you were napping, and the gas stove was left on. The whole kitchen smelled like a leak. You could have blown up the entire house and died. Dad, we had to turn it off and open all the windows." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I stared at my daughter, feeling the ground beneath my boots turn to ash. The gas stove. For a fraction of a second, my mind played tricks on me. I imagined the smell of gas. I remembered the warmth of that kitchen. Diane used to stand at that exact stove, humming to old jazz records while she simmered her famous Sunday pot roasts. The aroma of garlic and rosemary used to fill these walls, making this empty house feel like a home. But when Diane lost her battle with sickness 2 years ago, the music stopped. The cooking stopped. I looked toward the kitchen archway. I had not turned on that gas stove in exactly 2 years. I lived exclusively on cold sandwiches, microwave meals, and coffee from an electric maker. I had even shut off the main gas valve behind the appliance months ago because I had no use for it. It was physically impossible for me to have left the stove on yesterday. A terrifying, icy realization washed over me. I was not losing my mind. My daughter was deliberately lying to my face. Why? Why would she make up a story about me almost blowing up the house? Why would Preston look so completely calm about a missing $35,000? I looked at their faces again. Victoria was performing the role of a highly concerned, stressed-out daughter flawlessly. Preston was playing the patient, misunderstood son-in-law. If I were just a regular, grieving old farmer, I would have broken down right then and there. I would have apologized for my declining memory. I would have surrendered my independence to them. But they had forgotten one crucial detail about my past. Before I moved to this farm, before I became the quiet old man who tended to chickens, I spent 30 years as a federal prosecutor. I had stared into the eyes of the most ruthless, manipulative, white-collar criminals in the country. I knew exactly what a lie looked like. I knew the subtle, micro-expressions of a sociopath cornered in a lie. I was seeing those exact same expressions right now on the faces of my own family. My gut screamed at me to throw them out to demand my money back, to rip the truth out of them. But my old prosecutor instincts kicked in cold and calculating. If I confronted them now without solid proof, they would escalate their narrative. They would use my anger as further proof of my supposed mental instability. To win this war, I had to play their game. I had to let them believe they had won the battle. I let my shoulders slump. I forced my hands to shake a little more visibly. I looked down at the floor, imitating the posture of a defeated, confused senior citizen. I left the stove on," murmured, letting my voice crack with manufactured vulnerability. Yes, Dad, Victoria said, her voice instantly softening into that fake sugary tone. It terrified us. You are getting older. The grief is catching up to you. You cannot handle all this stress anymore. I slowly nodded, keeping my eyes averted so she could not see the absolute rage burning behind them. You might be right, I whispered. I am just so tired. Preston stood up, buttoning his jacket with a satisfied smirk. Do not worry about the tax notice, Harrison. I will call the county assessor on Monday and clear up their clerical error. You just focus on resting. We will take care of everything. As they walked out the front door, leaving me alone in the quiet farmhouse, I stood by the window and watched their luxury car disappear down the dark road. My sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. They thought I was a clueless old man waiting to die. They thought they could steal my money and gaslight me into an asylum. But they had just woken up a sleeping lion. The hunt had officially begun. The morning after their visit, Victoria showed up at the farm before the sun had crested the horizon. She walked into my kitchen, holding a small, unmarked amber prescription bottle. She set it on the granite counter next to my coffee maker with a soft, patronizing smile. Dad, I spoke with Dr. Aris this morning, she said, pouring me a cup of coffee. He agrees with Preston and me. The grief, the isolation is taking a toll on your cognitive functions. He prescribed these vitamins to help support your memory and keep you sharp. I stared at the little amber bottle. It looked innocent enough, just a plastic cylinder filled with small white capsules. But a voice in the back of my head, a very old, very cynical voice that had interrogated mob bosses and embezzlers, whispered to me, "Do not take them." I knew I should listen to that sharp instinct. It had kept me alive in courtrooms for decades without fail. But she was my daughter. She was the little girl I had taught to ride a bicycle, the teenager I had proudly sent off to college, the woman I had walked to marry Preston. How could I let my paranoid prosecutor brain accuse my own flesh and blood of foul play over a forgotten gas stove? I convinced myself that the stress of the foreclosure notice was making me jumpy. I needed to trust my family. So, I unscrewed the cap, took out a pill and swallowed it with my coffee. Victoria beamed, kissing me on the cheek before grabbing her coat and leaving for the city. She told me she would text me every morning to make sure I took my medicine, and for the sake of family peace, I did exactly what I was told. Within exactly 2 long weeks, my entire physical reality began to warp into a nightmare. It started as a subtle heaviness behind my eyes, a dark, persistent, muddy fog that seemed to settle heavily over my brain by mid-morning. I used to wake up easily at 5 daily to tend to the vegetable garden and read the financial papers. By the end of the first week on the pills, I was struggling to drag myself out of bed before 10:00. My legs felt like they were filled with wet sand. Every step took an effort. I would sit on the edge of the mattress, gasping for air like a drowning man. Then came the tremors. I noticed it first while trying to sign a delivery receipt for some chicken feed. My hand shook so violently that the pen slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the porch. The delivery driver looked at me with a sense of deep, uncomfortable pity. It was the kind of look you give a dying animal. It made my stomach turn. By the second week, the mental fog had thickened into a solid wall. Thoughts would form in my head, sharp and clear, only to dissolve into white noise before I could articulate them. I found myself staring at the living room wall for hours, unable to remember what I was supposed to be doing. The brilliant legal mind that had spent decades outsmarting the most devious criminals in the country was being reduced to mush. I felt like a prisoner trapped inside a failing body. Every memory of Diane, every detail of our life together felt painfully distant and utterly unreachable. But despite the lethargy dragging me down, a singular thought kept piercing through the fog. The tax default notice. Preston had promised he would call the county and fix the error. He had sworn my $35,000 was exactly where it needed to be. But the paranoia had taken root. I needed to know for certain. I needed to look at my bank statements and trace the wire transfer myself. One afternoon, while the farmhouse was quiet, I sat down at the kitchen table and pulled my laptop toward me. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, shaking uncontrollably. I tried to type in the web address for my bank, but my blurry vision made the letters swim on the screen. It took me 3 attempts just to get to the login portal. The bright screen glared back at me, mocking my sudden incompetence. I wiped the sweat from my brow. I clicked on the username field, I typed it in, then I moved to the password box. I stared at the blinking cursor. My mind went blank. I closed my eyes, rubbing my temples, trying to force my brain to work. I had used the same password for this account for 5 years. It was a combination of Diane's maiden name and our anniversary year, a simple sequence that was burned into my memory. But when I reached into the filing cabinet of my mind to retrieve it, the drawer was empty. There was nothing there, just a cloud of white noise. Panic began to bubble in my chest. My breathing turned shallow and rapid. I typed in what I thought was the password. Incorrect. I tried a variation. Perhaps I had capitalized the wrong letter. Incorrect. My hands were trembling so badly that I was hitting the wrong keys. I hit the enter button a 3rd time. A red warning box flashed on the screen. Your account has been temporarily locked due to multiple failed login attempts. Please contact customer service. I shoved the laptop away, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed my cell phone from the table, my trembling thumbs fumbling over the screen to dial the bank's customer service line. The voice prompted me to enter my account number. I pulled my debit card from my wallet and typed the 16 digits. Then came the prompt. Please enter your 4-digit telephone security PIN to speak with a representative. I froze. The phone pressed against my ear felt like a block of ice. 4 digits, just 4 numbers. I knew this PIN. I knew it like I knew my own name. But as I stood there in my kitchen staring at the wall, the numbers refused to materialize. The drugs coursing through my bloodstream had built a dam between me and my own memories. Please enter your 4-digit telephone security. PIN, the voice repeated. Come on, Harrison, I muttered my voice. Think, just think. I punched in a sequence. The year I became a federal prosecutor. I waited, holding my breath. I am sorry, that PIN is incorrect. You have 2 attempts remaining. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The room started to spin slightly. The lethargy from the morning pill was pulling me down, begging me to go back to bed and forget about it. But the terror of losing control kept me anchored to the floor. I typed in another set of numbers. Diane's birth month and day. I am sorry that PIN is incorrect. You have 1 attempt remaining before your account is frozen for your protection. I lowered the phone from my ear. My chest heaved as I struggled to draw in air. I looked down at my shaking hands. They belonged to an old man. They did not look like the hands that had once slammed legal briefs onto mahogany tables demanding justice. They looked weak. I felt weak. I hit the end call button and let the phone drop onto the table. The silence of the farmhouse crashed down on me heavy and suffocating. I sank into a chair, burying my face in my trembling hands. For the first time since Diane died, I felt completely terrified. I was locked out of my own finances. I had no way to verify if Preston had stolen my $35,000. I had no way to prove that the foreclosure notice was real. And worst of all, I was losing the only weapon I had left to fight back. My own. My Victoria and Preston had insisted these pills would clear my head. They had looked me in the eye and promised they were helping me. But as I sat there, shaking and confused, unable to remember a 4-digit number, a chilling realization sliced through the haze. They were not trying to cure me. They were trying to erase me. The next few days passed in a blur of agonizing clarity mixed with chemical exhaustion. I knew the pills they were giving me were poison, but I also knew that if I suddenly stopped taking them completely, Victoria and Preston would know I had figured out their game. I had to maintain the facade. I continued to take the pills when Victoria was watching, secretly spitting them into my palm and hiding them in my pockets. But enough of the drug was already in my system to keep my hands trembling and my mind wading through thick mud. They visited again on a Sunday morning, bringing an expensive box of pastries from downtown Richmond. Victoria breezed through the front door with her usual counterfeit cheerfulness. loudly asking how her favorite father was doing. Preston trailed behind her, checking his watch, radiating impatient obligation. I was standing by the kitchen counter trying to pour a cup of black coffee. The heavy ceramic mug felt like it weighed 50 pounds. "Here, let me help you with that, Dad," Victoria said, stepping forward with a completely fake look of deep concern plastered across her face. "I can do it," I muttered, trying to sound frail. I grasped the mug and lifted it. My hand began to shake violently. The dark liquid sloshed over the rim, burning my knuckles. I tried to steady my grip, but the tremors were too severe. The mug slipped and crashed onto the hardwood floor, sending a spray of hot coffee and jagged ceramic shards across the room. "Oh, for heaven's sake," pressed inside heavily. "I am sorry," I whispered immediately, dropping to my knees. I blindly gathered the broken pieces, letting my hands tremble even more than they naturally were. I kept my head down, playing the part of the pathetic, ruined old farmer they desperately wanted me to be. "Do not cut yourself, Dad," Victoria said, her voice laced with fake sympathy. "Just leave it. I will get the mop." She walked toward this utility closet down the hall. I remained on the floor, carefully picking up a sharp piece of ceramic. From my position on the ground, I had a clear view of the large sliding glass door that led out to the back patio. The morning sun was hitting the glass at just the right angle, turning it into a perfect dark mirror. I looked at the reflection in the glass. Preston was standing behind me, leaning against the kitchen island. He was not looking down at me with pity or concern. His face was twisted into a sneer of absolute undisguised disgust. It was a look of cold, calculating impatience. Victoria walked back into the kitchen with the mop. She paused next to her husband, looking down at me as I continued to fumble with the broken pieces on the floor. Preston leaned in close to her ear. His voice was nothing more than a faint hiss, but the kitchen was quiet enough for the sound to carry directly to me. "He is practically useless now," Preston whispered, his eyes fixed on my shaking back. "It will not be long." Victoria did not reprimand him. She did not defend her father. She simply gave a short, silent nod of agreement and handed him a paper towel. As I stared at their reflection, a profound silence settled over my mind. The chemical fog that had been suffocating my brain vanished, burned away by a sudden flash of absolute rage. The trembling in my hands stopped entirely. I knelt there on the floor, clutching the broken ceramic, and let the sheer audacity of his words sink into my bones. "He is practically useless now." In that fraction of a second, the image of the weak widower shattered completely. That specific look of arrogant contempt on Preston's face flipped a deeply buried switch in my brain. It was the exact same expression I used to see on arrogant Wall Street fraudsters, right before I destroyed their lives 30 years ago. I remembered sitting across polished tables from men just like Preston, men who believed their slick words made them untouchable. They thought they could manipulate the system, steal from the innocent, and walk away clean. They always smiled until the moment I dropped irrefutable evidence of their crimes in front of a judge and watched the color drain from their faces. For 30 years, I was the apex predator in those courtrooms. I built cases so airtight that defense attorneys advised clients to plead guilty rather than face me. When Diane died, I packed away that part of myself. I traded tailored suits for flannel shirts and legal briefs for garden tools. I wanted peace. I wanted to rest. But seeing Preston standing in my kitchen plotting my demise with my daughter, I realized my retirement had been a mistake. I was not a sick old man. I was a target hunted by amateurs. They thought they had found a vulnerable victim with a thick bank account and a fading memory. They thought they could drug me into compliance, steal my property, and throw me into a cheap nursing home to rot. They had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy focus of my past career wash over me. The prosecutor inside me was fully awake, and he was hungry. I knew exactly what I had to do. I could not confront them yet. I needed evidence. I needed a paper trail. I needed to build a prosecution case so devastating that neither of them would ever recover. I let out a ragged, pathetic sigh and allowed my hands to start shaking again. I dropped the piece of ceramic and slowly pushed myself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the counter for support. I am so sorry, Victoria, I stammered, making my voice tremble perfectly. I just cannot seem to hold on to anything today. My hands simply will not cooperate. Victoria patted my arm, her fake smile firmly back in place. It is okay, Dad. That is why we are here to take care of you. You just go sit down in your recliner and rest. I will clean up this mess. I nodded meekly and shuffled slowly toward the living room, dragging my feet exactly the way a heavily medicated man would. I slumped into my old leather armchair, closing my eyes as if I were exhausted by the simple effort of walking. In reality, my mind was racing at 1,000 meters an hour. Every detail of the room, every word they had spoken, every financial transaction I could remember, was being categorized and filed away for future use. I listened to the sound of Victoria mopping the kitchen floor and Preston typing away on his expensive smartphone. They felt secure in their deception. They genuinely believed the hardest part of their plan was over. They had no idea that the real game had just begun. The battle lines were drawn in the spilled coffee on my kitchen floor, and I was going to ensure that when the dust settled, I would be the only one left standing. The next morning, the routine played out exactly as it had for the past 2 weeks. Victoria called at 8 to ensure I was awake and to remind me to take my medicine. I kept my voice weak and raspy, assuring her I had the bottle right in my hand. I unscrewed the cap, took out one of the small white capsules, and walked into the bathroom. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, and my skin held a sickly pale hue. I tossed the pill into the toilet and flushed it away. I watched the swirling water carry it out of sight, and with it went the last shred of blind trust I held for my daughter. Over the next 48 hours, I repeated this performance. Every morning and every evening, a pill went down the drain. The withdrawal was brutal. My body ached with deep muscle cramps, and relentless headaches pounded behind my temples as the chemical sludge filtered out of my system. But by the morning of the third day, the heavy curtain lifted. My thoughts snapped back into sharp focus. The lingering cognitive fog vanished, and the calculating mind of a federal prosecutor returned in full force. My hands were steady as I poured my black coffee. I was back. But Victoria and Preston could not know that. Whenever they visited or called, I maintained the facade, letting my hands tremble and allowing my words to trail off into whispers. I needed proof of what was hidden inside those capsules. I knew better than to visit my regular physician in Richmond. Victoria was listed as my emergency contact and possessed medical proxy rights on my file. Any toxicology test requested locally would generate a notification and trigger an alert to her smartphone. I had to go off the grid. I bypassed my sedan equipped with GPS tracking and walked to the barn. Under a tarp was my farm truck from the 90s. I grabbed the keys, tossed the amber pill bottle onto the passenger seat, and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life with a loud mechanical grumble. I drove 50 miles, taking unpaved back roads, until I reached a rural clinic nestled between 2 farm towns. The waiting room was empty. I walked up to the front reception desk and paid $300 in cash for a confidential consultation. I used a variation of my middle name to register. The attending doctor was a tired-looking man with gray hair, who seemed surprised to have an elderly walk-in patient ask for toxicology testing. I sat down on the examination table and handed him the small white capsule, along with a $50 bill to guarantee an expedited process. I told him I needed to know what chemical compounds were inside that pill, and I required a blood panel to determine what toxins were circulating through my veins. He frowned, turning the capsule over in his gloved hands, but the cash payment and my tone left him no room for argument. He assured me I would have the results by the following afternoon. I thanked him, walked back out to my truck, and began the drive home. The adrenaline rushing from the secret mission kept my mind racing. I was calculating my next legal moves, plotting how to dismantle Preston's financial web as I navigated the country roads. My mind turned over the reality of my situation. I had dedicated my professional career to putting criminals behind bars. I had spent decades analyzing financial fraud, evaluating testimonies, and protecting vulnerable citizens from the type of predatory behavior my family was executing. The audacity of their plan was staggering. They believed that because I was a grieving widower, I had forgotten how to fight. They assumed my age made me defenseless. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling a sense of clarity wash over me. I was not just going to stop them. I was going to dismantle their operation, leaving them with nothing. Lost in my planning, I did not realize how much time had passed. I glanced down at the dashboard clock. It was almost noon. Victoria always called the kitchen landline at noon on her lunch break to monitor my condition. If I did not answer the phone, she would panic. If she panicked, she would send Preston to the farm to investigate. They would realize I was lucid capable and operating an investigation right behind their backs. I slammed my boot down onto the gas pedal. The truck rattled as I pushed it past the speed limit, tearing down the rural highways. Pine trees blurred past my windows. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. I calculated the remaining distance and the time. It was going to be close. I swerved onto my dirt driveway, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust. Before I even brought the truck to a stop behind the barn, I could hear it. The ringing of the landline phone echoing from the kitchen window. I killed. The engine threw open the door and sprinted across the yard. The phone rang again. It was on its fifth ring. One more ring, and she would hang up and assume the worst. I tore open the screen door, lunged across the kitchen floor, and snatched the receiver off the wall mount just as the sixth ring began. I held the phone to my chest for 1 second. I forced my heart to calm down. I let out a breath and brought the receiver to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice trembling and raspy. Dad Victoria's voice barked through the speaker. I was about to call Preston and have him drive out there. "Is everything all right?" "I am sorry, sweetheart," I mumbled, forcing a chuckle. I was out on the porch. It took me a minute to remember where the ringing was coming from. My legs are so heavy today. I think the medicine is making me sleepy. She let out a sigh. The tension in her voice vanished, replaced once again by that artificial sweetness. "Oh, Dad, you need to be careful. Do not push yourself. The vitamins are doing their job, helping your brain heal. Did you take your morning dose?" I looked at the empty amber bottle resting in my pocket. "Yes, Victoria," I whispered, staring at the kitchen wall. "I took it exactly like you told me to. I am following all your instructions." "Good," she replied. "Preston and I will come by this weekend to check on things. Just stay in the house, Dad. We will handle everything from here." I hung up the phone slowly and let the false facade drop completely. I stood tall in the very center of the quiet kitchen, my breathing steadying my old mind sharp and clear. The trap was set and the greedy hunters had no idea they were walking into a cage. The telephone rang just past 2 in the afternoon the next day. I let it chime 3 times before picking up the receiver, ensuring my breathing was calm and measured. It was the doctor from the rural clinic, exactly as promised. He did not bother with pleasantries. His voice was tight, carrying a weight of deep professional concern that immediately set my nerves on edge. He asked if I was sitting down. I told him I was standing, but that my mind was perfectly clear and ready for whatever he had to say. He explained that this blood panel and the chemical breakdown of the capsule had yielded highly disturbing results. The pills my daughter had given me were not vitamins. They did not contain a single trace of any dietary supplement. They were a concentrated generic formulation of a potent antipsychotic medication, a drug specifically designed to treat extreme cases of acute schizophrenia and violent psychotic episodes. The dosage in those capsules was dangerously high, especially for a man of my age. The doctor explained that introducing such heavy neuroleptics into a healthy brain would rapidly mimic the late stages of severe dementia. It forces the nervous system to shut down. It creates artificial tremors, profound confusion, memory blockages, and an overwhelming lethargy that essentially traps the patient inside their own failing body. He warned me that prolonged exposure could cause irreversible neurological damage or induce a fatal cardiac event. He urged me to contact the authorities immediately, offering to forward his lab results to the local police precinct. I thanked him for his diligence, politely declined his offer to involve the police just yet, and asked him to mail a physical copy of the certified lab report to a private post office box I maintained under a different name. I hung up the phone. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. My own daughter, my own flesh and blood, had systematically poisoned me. She had smiled in my face, kissed my cheek, and handed me the very chemical chains meant to drag me into a padded cell. The betrayal was so absolute, so profoundly evil that it transcended anger. It solidified into a cold, unbreakable sheet of pure tactical resolve. I knew Victoria was busy with a corporate media launch that afternoon, which meant Preston would be the one assigned to execute the daily welfare check. He arrived at the farm just before 5 o'clock. The gravel crunched under the heavy tires of his luxury sedan. I watched him from the kitchen window. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his expensive Italian wool coat, looking around my property with the calculating eyes of a real estate developer surveying a vacant lot. He walked up the porch steps, not bothering to knock, and let himself in using the spare key I had foolishly given them years ago. I quickly shuffled into the living room, slumping my shoulders and allowing a pronounced tremor to take over my hands. I stared blankly at the unlit fireplace, mouth slightly open, performing the role of the heavily sedated father to perfection. Preston walked into the room, stopping a few feet away from my chair. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not offer a warm greeting. He simply stood there, pulling a sleek leather notebook from his breast pocket and jotting something down. "Harrison," he said, his voice loud and condescending. "Did you take your afternoon dose?" Victoria said, "You sounded a bit out of sorts on the phone yesterday. We need to make sure you are staying on top of your regimen." I slowly turned my head toward him, blinking several times as if trying to focus my vision. "Yes," I murmured, letting my voice crack. "I took them, but my head feels so heavy today, Preston. Everything is spinning." He let out a short, dismissive sigh, clearly annoyed by my existence. "Well, the doctor said it takes time for your brain chemistry to balance out. You just need to sit quietly and let the medication do its work." As he spoke, he reached into the right pocket of his wool coat to retrieve his ringing cell phone. When he pulled the phone out, the fabric of the pocket pulled back just enough for me to catch a glimpse of something metallic reflecting the afternoon light. It was a small, uniquely shaped brass key attached to a heavy silver ring. I recognized it instantly. It was the master key to the heavy floor safe hidden behind the false paneling in my study. A month ago, when I first noticed the key missing from my nightstand, Victoria had spent an hour helping me search the house. She had held my hands, looked me in the eye, and gently told me that my memory was failing, that I must have misplaced it during one of my confused episodes. She had used my own missing property as the first brick in her foundation of gaslighting, and all along that key had been resting comfortably in her husband's pocket. I needed that key. If they were accessing my safe, they were accessing the original deeds, the bearer bonds, and the legal structures of my entire estate. I knew I had to get it back right then and there, but I could not simply demand it. If I confronted him, he would know the dementia was a ruse. I had to steal it. During the late 80s, I spearheaded a massive federal takedown of a vast organized crime syndicate operating out of the eastern seaboard. To build my case, I had relied heavily on a street-level informant named Jimmy, a master pickpocket, who had turned state evidence. During our many long hours in the safe house, Jimmy had taught me the mechanics of the dip. He explained that successful theft was not about speed, but about misdirection. You had to create a physical shock, a sudden overwhelming point of contact that overloaded the target's sensory perception, making them completely blind to the subtle movement of your hands. I never in my wildest dreams imagined I would employ a mobster's street trick against my own son-in-law in my own living room. I gripped the armrests of my chair and began to push myself up. I made my legs shake violently. "Preston, I need water," I gasped. He rolled his eyes and took a step toward me. "Just sit down, Harrison. I will get it from the kitchen." As he reached out to push me back into the chair, I executed the maneuver. I allowed my eyes to roll back into my head. I let all the tension drain from my knees, completely simulating a sudden massive fainting spell. My dead weight collapsed forward directly into Preston. He grunted in surprise, dropping his phone on the carpet as he instinctively threw both of his arms around my torso to catch me. His hands gripped my shoulders tight, his entire focus consumed by the sudden physical burden of my collapsing body. He was completely overloaded by the shock of the moment. In that exact second, while his attention was entirely focused on keeping us both from crashing to the floor, my right hand slipped smoothly and silently into the open pocket of his wool coat. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of the brass key. I pinched it between my index and middle finger, sliding it out with a fluid, practiced motion. I immediately tucked the key into the waistband of my trousers, pulling my sweater down to conceal it. The entire extraction took less than 2 seconds. "What is wrong with you?" he snapped, struggling to push my heavy frame back into the leather armchair. "Stand up, Harrison. Come on, sit back down." I let him maneuver me back into the seat. I slumped against the cushions, letting out a long, ragged breath, blinking wildly as if I had just regained consciousness. "I am sorry," I whispered weakly. The room just went completely black. I felt so dizzy. Preston dusted off his expensive coat with a look of utter revulsion. He bent down to retrieve his fallen phone, completely unaware that his pocket was now lighter. "This is exactly why you cannot be left alone anymore," he muttered, typing a rapid message on his screen. "You are becoming a massive liability. I will get you a glass of tap water, and then I have to leave. I have a business meeting." He turned his back on me and marched toward the kitchen. The moment he was out of sight, I reached into my waistband and pulled out the brass key. The metal felt heavy and cold against my palm. I gripped it tightly, feeling the sharp edges press into my skin. It was not just a piece of metal. It was the key to my survival. It was the proof that they were already inside my vault, dismantling my life from the inside out. Preston returned, shoving a glass of water onto the side table. "Drink that and stay in this chair," he ordered. "Victoria will call you tonight." I nodded slowly, keeping my hands folded in my lap, hiding the stolen key. "Thank you, Preston," I murmured. "You are a good son," he sneered, turned on his heel, and walked out the front door. I listened to his luxury car start up and crunch its way down the driveway. I did not move until the sound of the engine completely faded into the distance. Then I sat up straight. The tremors vanished, the weakness evaporated. I looked down at the brass key resting in my palm. The rage that had been simmering in my chest crystallized into pure, unadulterated purpose. They had poisoned my body. They had insulted my intelligence. Now they were robbing my vault. The time for hiding was over. It was time to strike back. Every piece of evidence I gathered from now on would be a nail in their proverbial coffins. I was not going to simply survive this attack against my life. I was going to utterly dismantle their fraudulent reality, just as cruel as they had tried to erase mine. I waited until the sun dipped below the treeline and the farm was wrapped in total darkness. I knew better than to use the landline or my cell phone. If Preston and Victoria were bold enough to drug me and steal the key to my safe, they were certainly capable of monitoring my call logs. During my afternoon trip to the rural clinic, I had purchased a cheap prepaid cellular phone with a handful of cash. I pulled the small plastic device from my boot, powered it on, and dialed a number I had memorized over 20 years ago. The line rang twice before a deep, growly voice answered. It was Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was a titan in the world of civil law, a man who navigated courtrooms with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a shark. We had fought on opposite sides of the aisle many times during my days as a federal prosecutor. Over the years, that professional rivalry had melted into a profound, unspoken respect. He was the only person I could trust with a secret of this magnitude. "Jonathan," I said, keeping my voice low. "It is Harrison Caldwell. I am using an unregistered phone. Do not return a call to my primary number." There was a brief pause on the line. Harris and Jonathan replied, his tone immediately shifting from casual to strictly business. You do not buy burner phones to chat about the weather. What is happening? I laid out the facts with the clinical detachment of a man presenting an indictment. I told him about the property tax default notice. I told him about the antipsychotic drugs my own daughter had disguised as vitamins. I told him about Preston stealing the key to my hidden floor safe. I did not offer emotional commentary. I simply gave him the evidence. I reminded him that if this failed, I would lose everything I had built for my family, my land, and my freedom. He promised me he would move heaven and earth to prevent that. Jonathan remained silent for a long moment after I finished. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet, terrifying anger. They are setting you up for a fraudulent conservatorship, Harrison. They are trying to medically establish your incompetence so they can seize your assets. Bill, we need to document their actions immediately. I need eyes inside my own house, I told him. I need them to catch Preston opening that safe. But it has to be completely off the books. No official security companies, no paper trails they can find. I have a private technical team, Jonathan assured me, former federal surveillance experts who work exclusively for my firm. They are discreet and they are fast. I will send them to your farm tonight. Leave the back door unlocked. The hours before midnight crawled by with agonizing slowness. I sat in the dark living room, watching the faint moonlight filter through the curtains. I ran through every possible legal scenario in my head. I was no longer a father trying to understand his child. I was an investigator building a trap. Precisely at midnight, two unmarked dark sedans rolled silently up my dirt driveway. The headlights were extinguished. Three men dressed in dark nondescript clothing slipped out of the vehicles and moved swiftly toward my back porch. They wore gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints and carried specialized gear bags that looked completely ordinary from the outside. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and let them inside. They did not ask questions. They offered no pleasantries. They simply went to work with a level of quiet professionalism that instantly put me at ease. The lead technician, a tall man with sharp eyes, handed me a secure tablet. He explained that they would be installing military-grade micro-cameras directly into the architectural molding of the living room and the study. The lenses were no larger than the head of a pin, completely invisible to the naked eye. The video feeds would be encrypted and uploaded directly to a secure server at Jonathan's law firm. If Preston or Victoria stepped foot in this house, every movement, every whisper would be captured and preserved as irrefutable legal evidence. I directed them to the study first. I pointed to the heavy oak bookshelves lining the far wall. The floor safe was hidden beneath a false section of hardwood directly below the bottom shelf. The technicians nodded and began drilling microscopic holes into the crown molding near the ceiling. They worked with surgical precision, routing tiny wires behind the drywall. I watched them in the dim light of a desk lamp, feeling a strange mix of relief and profound sorrow. I was turning my own sanctuary into an active surveillance zone to catch my daughter committing a felony. The reality of that fact weighed heavily on my chest, but I pushed the emotion aside. This was a war of survival. Every second ticked loudly in my ears, reminding me that we were operating in a highly vulnerable window of time. If Preston had decided to return for another surprise check, the entire operation would be exposed instantly. The installation process, however, proved to be far more complicated than anticipated. The thick century-old plaster and dense oak beams of my farmhouse resisted their modern tools. What was supposed to be a rapid 45-minute operation stretched into 90 minutes. They had successfully wired the study and were moving out into the main living room to establish a secondary camera angle. The lead technician signaled that they needed another 30 minutes to conceal the power transmitter behind the fireplace mantel. I stood watch by the front window, keeping my eyes fixed on the long, dark stretch of road leading up to my property. It was exactly 1:45 in the morning when the silent alarm triggered. A small blue light flashed on the digital monitor I kept next to the front door. The monitor was connected to a motion sensor I had installed at the very entrance of my driveway years ago to track delivery trucks. Someone had just turned onto my property. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. My breathing quickened as the reality of the situation washed over me. The entire operation was hanging by a delicate microscopic thread. The tech team was actively pulling wiring across the center of the living room floor. The heavy mantelpiece was partially detached from the wall. There were tools scattered across the rug. I pressed a button on the monitor to pull up the live feed from the gate camera. A sleek black luxury SUV was creeping up the driveway, moving slowly so the gravel would not make too much noise. The license plate was unmistakable. It was Victoria. She was coming to check on me. My mind raced to analyze her motivation. Why would she drive all the way out here at nearly 2 in the morning? The answer hit me like a physical blow. The evening dose. I had flushed my nighttime pill down the toilet hours ago, but I had not texted her to confirm I had taken it. I had been so focused on coordinating with Jonathan and the surveillance team that I had neglected to maintain the illusion of compliance. Victoria, obsessed with keeping my system flooded with those anti-psychotic drugs, had driven out here in the dead of night to force the pill down my throat herself. I knew she was ruthless, but driving out to the farm at 2:00 in the morning proved how deeply she was committed to this dark scheme. The stakes were absolute life and death. Now I spun around to face the technicians. "We have a vehicle approaching," I whispered sharply, my voice carrying across the silent room. "You have exactly 2 minutes before she is at the front door." The 3 men moved instantly. They began rolling up the exposed wires and shoving their equipment into their black duffel bags. But the living room was a mess. The thick white plaster dust from the heavy drilling was glaringly visible on the dark, polished hardwood floor. The mantelpiece was still slightly misaligned. There was absolutely no way they could pack their gear, clean the evidence, and exit the house without Victoria noticing the disruption. The bright headlights of her SUV swept across the front windows, casting long, terrifying shadows across the living room walls. I could hear the crunch of the tires as she pulled the vehicle to a stop right behind the unmarked sedans belonging to the tech team. She would see those cars. She would see the dust. She would realize the trap was being set, and the entire prosecution would crumble before I could even file a single document. I needed to buy them time. I needed to create a distraction so monumental and so disturbing that she would forget about the strange cars, forget about the dust on the floor, and focus entirely on me. I looked at the lead technician. "Go out the back window," I ordered quietly. "Do not stop moving until you reach the tree. I will handle her and buy you the minutes you need." The heavy slam of a car door echoed through the cold night air. The sound of her expensive heels began to click rhythmically against the stone walkway leading up to the porch. I had 10 seconds left. I had to become the broken, helpless old man she believed she had created, and I had to do it right outside before she could ever turn the knob of my front door. I threw open the heavy oak front door and stepped out onto the porch. The freezing night air hit my bare skin like a physical blow. I was wearing nothing but thin cotton pajamas, and the temperature had plummeted well below freezing. The shock of the cold was immediate and severe, but I welcomed it. It made my physical reaction genuine. I began to shiver violently, my teeth chattering as I stumbled down the wooden steps and onto the frozen gravel of the driveway. I wrapped my arms around my chest, hunching my shoulders, and began to wander aimlessly toward the blinding headlights of her luxury vehicle. I widened my eyes, forcing a look of absolute hollow terror onto my face. I let my jaw go slack. I needed to look like a man whose mind had completely detached from reality. I had to become a man wandering blindly through a shattered memory, terrified of the shadows lost in his own home. Victoria killed the engine and slammed her door shut. I heard the sharp crunch of her designer boots on the gravel as she marched toward me. Even in the darkness, I could see the fury radiating from her posture. "What on earth are you doing out here, Harrison?" she snapped, not even bothering to use the word dad. Her voice was sharp, laced with cold irritation rather than parental concern. "Get back inside this instant. Are you trying to catch pneumonia?" I did not look directly at her. Instead, I stared past her shoulder into the dark woods, raising a trembling hand to point at nothing. "Diane," I wailed, letting my voice crack with pathetic desperation. "Diane, is that you? Where have you been? I have been looking everywhere. I cannot find the keys, Diane. The house is so cold." Victoria stopped dead in her tracks. The sheer volume of my apparent delusion caught her completely off guard. She stared at me, shivering in the frost, barefoot on the jagged stones, crying out for a woman who had been buried for years. I stumbled forward, reaching out into the empty air, grasping at ghosts. I could practically see the gears turning behind her eyes. The irritation morphed into a twisted, victorious satisfaction. She truly believed her toxic pills had finally pushed me over the edge into full-blown dementia. She stepped forward and grabbed me by the bicep. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingernails digging through the thin fabric of my pajamas. "Stop this nonsense," she commanded, pulling me toward the porch. "Diane is dead. You are confused. Move your feet." I resisted. I planted my bare feet firmly in the freezing gravel and let my body go completely limp, forcing her to support my entire weight. "No, no," I pleaded, shaking my head frantically. "I have to wait for her," she said. "She was coming right back. Do not make me go inside. It is not safe in there. The shadows are moving. I am frightened." I dragged out the struggle, pulling against her, stumbling over the stones, doing everything in my power to keep us outside in the freezing air. Every second I stalled was another second the surveillance team had to secure their gear, wipe away the plaster dust, and vanish into the forest. Victoria groaned in frustration, struggling to hold my heavy frame upright. She dug her heels into the dirt, cursing under her breath. "Get up, you foolish old man," she growled, completely dropping her loving daughter persona. "You are going to ruin everything if you die of exposure out here in the yard. Stand up." I let my knees buckle again, scraping my shins against the icy driveway. I moaned in fabricated agony, clutching at her expensive cashmere coat like a frightened child seeking refuge. "Please," I sobbed, burying my face against her sleeve. "They are watching me in there. The men in the walls are watching me. I cannot go back inside." The irony of my words was not lost on me, but to Victoria, it was just another symptom of profound psychotic paranoia. She yanked her arm away, repulsed by my touch. "You are hallucinating, Harrison. There is no one in the walls. There is no one here but you and me. Now walk." I dragged my feet, forcing her to literally pull me inch by inch up the wooden steps. I counted the seconds in my head. 10, 20, 30. I needed to give Jonathan's team absolute certainty. I intentionally tripped over the top step, sprawling hard onto the wooden deck of the porch. I lay there on my stomach, gasping for air, letting the bitter cold seep deep into my bones. Victoria brutally kicked my left leg, a sharp, incredibly cruel motion that spoke undeniable volumes about the true blackness of her heart. I said, "Get up," she hissed, leaning down so her face was inches from mine. "You are not going to ruin my plans tonight. You are going to go inside. You are going to take your medication and you are going to sleep." I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, whimpering softly. I allowed her to grab the collar of my pajama shirt and hoist me to my feet. We stumbled through the front door and collapsed into the main hallway. The sudden warmth of the house washed over me, but I did not stop shivering. I sank against the wall, pulling my knees to my chest and rocking back and forth. Victoria stood over me, panting heavily from the physical exertion. She smoothed down her expensive coat and glared at me with absolute contempt. She did not immediately look toward the living room. Her attention was entirely focused on managing the pathetic creature cowering at her feet. I risked a quick, subtle glance down the hall. The living room was perfectly dark. The heavy power tools were gone. The backsliding door was shut tight. The thick layer of white plaster dust had been hastily swept away. The tech team had vanished like phantoms in the night. "Stay right there," she ordered, turning on her heel and marching toward the kitchen. "Do not move a single muscle." I listened to her open the glass cabinets. running the cold tap water into a small plastic cup. She returned holding water in a white capsule. "You missed your nighttime dose," she said coldly. Crouching down to my level, she shoved the pill against my lips. "Open your mouth and swallow this right now." I whimpered but obediently opened my mouth. I placed the pill on my tongue, took a large gulp of water, and swallowed hard, making sure she saw my throat move. She watched me closely, waiting a full minute to ensure I had not hidden it. What she did not know was that I had already trapped the capsule inside my cheek. Satisfied, Victoria stood up, gave me a look of disgust, and left. As her car drove away, I spat the pill out. I looked up at the crown molding. A tiny red light blinked once. The cameras were live. The silent hunt for their ultimate destruction had officially begun. The silent hunt for their ultimate destruction had officially begun. The following morning broke with a heavy gray overcast that mirrored the cold determination settling deep into my bones. I sat alone at the kitchen island, a steaming mug of black coffee resting untouched beside the encrypted tablet Jonathan had provided. My hands were perfectly steady. The house was quiet, saved for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I powered on the tablet, entering the complex sequence of passcodes Jonathan had instructed me to use. The screen flickered to life, dividing into multiple high-definition grids. The visual clarity was astonishing. I could see every corner of my living room and every shadow in my study, all captured through microscopic lenses, completely invisible to the naked eye. I pulled the cheap burner phone from my pocket and dialed Jonathan. He answered on the first ring, his voice crisp and strictly professional. "We have secure feeds," Jonathan said. "No trace of interference. I have my forensic accounting team monitoring the stream from our dedicated server. We are waiting for your son-in-law to make his move." I did not have to wait long. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, the crunch of gravel signaled the arrival of a vehicle. I was sitting in my bedroom, intentionally leaving the main areas of the house empty. I had sent a text message to Victoria an hour earlier, claiming I was feeling incredibly weak and was going to take a long medicated sleep. She had undoubtedly relayed that information to Preston, giving him the perfect window of opportunity. I stared at the tablet screen. The front door opened with a quiet click. Preston stepped into the hallway. He moved with a practiced predatory caution, stepping lightly on the hardwood floors to avoid making the old boards creak. He paused at the base of the staircase, listening intently for any sound coming from my bedroom. Satisfied that the heavy dose of antipsychotics was keeping me unconscious, he turned and walked directly into the study. The camera positioned perfectly in the crown molding captured his face in pristine detail. There was no hesitation in his movements. He knew exactly where he was going and what he was looking for. I watched my jaw clenched as the man who had married my daughter walked around my heavy mahogany desk. He knelt on the antique Persian rug, rolling the heavy woven fabric back to expose the bare floorboards beneath. He ran his fingers along the edge of the wood, finding the hidden latch, and lifted the false panel. The heavy steel door of my floor safe was exposed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass key. The very same key I had pickpocketed from him, perfectly replicated at a local hardware store. Before I discreetly dropped the copy back into his coat pocket during a feigned stumble the previous evening, he inserted the copied key into the lock, turned it sharply, and pulled the heavy door open. A sickening wave of violation washed over me as I watched him reach his hands into my private vault. He pulled out thick manila folders containing the original deeds to the farm, the property lines, the bearer bonds, and the comprehensive outlines of my financial portfolios. He spread the documents across my desk like a feast. He pulled a sleek smartphone from his jacket pocket and activated the camera. For the next 20 minutes, the high-definition feed recorded Preston meticulously photographing every single page. He captured account numbers, routing codes, signature baselines, and legal descriptions of my assets. He was building a complete digital replica of my entire estate.